Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedicase. I have a couple degrees in theology, working on another in philosophy of religion, and throughout my time in my studies, I've had some really great conversations. But unfortunately, those haven't been recorded. So the goal of this podcast is to have similar conversations with experts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life, to then record those and share them with you so you get to learn as I learn. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking again with Joe Schmid. We're going to be talking about divine conceptualism and Platonism and kind of the debate between the two as it's been unfolding in the literature. Divine conceptualism saying that abstract objects like the abstract object of a triangle, or more particularly in this conversation, propositions, that propositions exist as the meanings of sentences. They're really out there. The Platonist says they exist in, well, somewhere. And the divine conceptualist says, no, we'll grab that somewhere and we'll put that right in God's mind. So that's the conversation. Joe's written a lot of really cool articles about this, mostly just going at Edward Feser. I think it started much more friendly, and then Feser was like, why is this dude obsessed with me? And then here we are. So it'll be really fun to talk with Joe about that. Before we jump in, though, thanks to everyone who has become a Patreon patron, who's making this show possible. This show is a lot of work. It's crazy. It's a stupid amount of work, but I love it. I would do it anyways. Probably shouldn't say that, but if this is your favorite podcast or YouTube channel, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. For $5 a month or more, you can get early access to episodes, as well as a bunch of other goodies over there, stickers and all sorts of fun stuff. So click the link in the description to check out my Patreon. You can leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That would be huge, as well as a comment. And you can like and subscribe. You can like this. You can comment and subscribe. Joe is pretty active on YouTube, so if you leave him a comment, he might respond here. Or another way to stalk him is to go to Parker's Pensées Penseurs. Guillaume Bignon taught me how to say that, but I can't remember now. But it's a Facebook group. If you can figure out how to spell it from my terrible pronunciation, go there and I will let you in, and you can talk a little bit more with Joe and myself. Okay, without further ado, let's pull him in and get talking about divine conceptualism versus Platonism concerning abstract objects like propositions. Joe, thanks so much for coming back on the show, man.
I'm excited for this. I enjoyed the many times that I've been on before, and I am looking forward to this.
Yeah, so we've talked about Feser already, and one of his proofs. He's got this book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, and they're pretty interesting. Again, like I said in the intro, man, it started off like a friendly thing, and then Feser was like, Joe's obsessed with me. What's going on? And I don't think he took it as nice anymore. But today we're going to be talking about his Augustinian proof. So he calls it scholastic realism. Maybe can you give us like a broad outline, a rough sketch of what is the Augustinian proof?
Yeah, and before we get it going, I just want to let the audience know that what kind of sparked all of this, I guess, was Anderson and Welty's 2011 article, "The Lord of Non-Contradiction," which it sounds better if you have an English accent, right? Because you say the law of non-contradiction, right? So it sounds better. It's like the Lord, the law. So, but yeah, it sounds better if you have an English accent. But that's kind of what sparked all of this. And so Alex Malpass recently wrote an article in the journal Sophia in response to that. And basically, I've also taken an interest in this because Anderson and Welty's argument is similar in relevant respects to an argument for God's existence, as you pointed out, in one of Edward Feser's proofs, the Augustinian proof. And as many listeners probably know, I have a book manuscript under review right now entitled Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. I go through a whole host of different purported proofs or demonstrations of the classical theistic God's existence, including all 5 of Feser's, but also some more. And one of them is the Augustinian proof. And I have a huge chapter on this. And I also go through in that chapter Anderson and Welty's argument. And I comment on Malpass's article and so on. And in fact, based on this chapter, I made a video on my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason, where I think it's titled something like "Do Abstract Objects Prove God?" So that's kind of the situatedness for the audience, the context.
Yeah.
But as for scholastic realism, Feser kind of demarcates the views into, well, of course, you have anti-realist views, but you also have realist views about abstract objects. And so abstract objects are roughly non-causal, non-spatiotemporal things like numbers, mathematical objects more generally, propositions, properties or universals, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, so we have anti-realism. That says that there are no such things. There are no abstract objects. Realism says that there are at least some such abstract objects. And so Feser divides realist views into at least three broad categories: Aristotelian realism, Platonic realism, and scholastic realism. On Feser's rendition, and I'm going off of memory here, but roughly, an Aristotelian realist says that, at least with respect to things like universals, yes, they exist, but they are immanent to things. They inhere in things. They exist in things. And so that is contrasted with the Platonic realist, which says, no, they're not immanent in things. They exist in a kind of transcendent realm, as it were.
Yeah.
They are non-spatiotemporal. They don't inhere in the things, but rather things stand in certain participation or exemplification or instantiation relations to the universals, which are non-spatiotemporal properties. So that's a kind of relationalist ontology, whereas the Aristotelian would have a more constituent ontology. The properties and universals are more like constituents of something. They are inherent in it some way, and that inherence is usually taken to be primitive, so it's hard to kind of unpack it further.
Right.
So that's the Aristotelian realist and the Platonic realist. But then there's a kind of via media, as it were, a middle way, and that is scholastic realism. So scholastic realism says that it agrees with Aristotelian realism that, yeah, there are immanent universals, there are universals and properties and so on that inhere in things. But also, there's a sense of transcendence to these sorts of things because they also exist in a necessarily existent infinite divine intellect. And that's God's intellect, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so propositions are typically construed as God's thoughts in some way. Properties might be God's concepts, and so on down the list. So this view has also been kind of come to be known as theistic conceptualism. And there are other sorts of nuances here, like you might have a theistic activist view where they're not necessarily, like God causally produces these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
You get a bunch of different technicalities and nuances, but roughly that's the terrain. So we're kind of focusing on theistic conceptualism / scholastic realism, where essentially abstract objects are located in the mind of God. So
that's good, dude. I'm so glad that you were able to give us a summary, because you talk super duper fast and you have great recall. So that was good. Joe, just a personal note here, man. You consider yourself a Platonist? Are you a realist about propositions, at least?
So I lean towards some form of realism about a number of abstract objects. I take myself to be leaning towards mathematical realism about mathematical objects. I lean towards realism about universals, and I lean towards realism about propositions. I lean towards anti-realism about possible worlds, but we can set that one aside for another discussion, of course. But so as for which form of realism, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, if you were to torture me and to force me to pick a view, I would pick Platonism, yes. But do not call me a Platonist, anyone, because I'm not exactly sure which precise form of realism. I think that there are robust contemporary defenses of Aristotelian realism. I think there are robust contemporary defenses of Platonic realism. I think that each one has certain respective advantages and disadvantages, and it's really difficult. And I also take anti-realism seriously. So my realist commitments are themselves just leanings. I need to research much more to have a very firmly settled view. So
and as Joe said, there's a lot of really good defenders for every. I mean, you had Kenny Boyce on, and Dungeons and Dragons aside, he just crushed it. He's super duper smart. There's a lot of, anyone who's a William Lane Craig fanboy, dude's a nominalist. And some days I'm like, he's insane. That's crazy. And I guess you just get to be an ostrich nominalist and stick your head in the sand. But then, man, if you were on the podcast, you'd absolutely eat my lunch on this.
Absolutely.
So it's unreal. Yeah. There's a lot of really tough positions, but what's fun about this conversation is, especially couching it in terms of Malpass versus Anderson and Welty, it's they have agreed on so much so far, and now they're to the point of okay, we both think that these things exist. Now, what's the best explanation for them? And it's kind of nice when you don't have to go through all the indispensability arguments and everything to try and prove propositions.
Oh my goodness.
So And your arguments against Feser do this. You're not saying well, I don't know, maybe some of your criticisms do this, but because he is kind of fast and loose, arguing against the different views, he goes pretty quick, right? But also you're saying there's internal inconsistencies for his view, and I thought you in your video that I watched, you talked about premise 9, 7, 11, and 4. Like those are the big ones. I have them in front of me. I'm sure you probably don't have those memorized, but I think you have the chapter pulled up, right? Can
I
you?
do, yeah.
Okay, good. Let's start with like premise 9 of his Augustinian proof.
Mhm.
What's the problem with let me read it real quick. If scholastic realism is true, then abstract objects exist not only in contingently existing intellects, but also in at least one necessarily existing intellect. So what's the problem there?
Well, what's difficult is that I numbered in my video, I kind of cut out some of the early portions of
Oh, gotcha.
Phaser's proof. Yeah, no,
Gotcha.
it's no worries. I cut out some of the early portions of Phaser's proof that I think were like saying that, oh, there are insuperable objections to nominalism, and
Yeah,
there are
yeah.
I can't believe that he was able to. Anyway, yeah, and he's like, there are insuperable objections to this view, and so
Yeah.
like, okay, okay, Boomer, that's what I want to say, but definitely not in Super Bowl, the objections that he raised, as Kenny Boyce demonstrated in his video with me, as well as I think his arguments against Platonism are very bad. But setting that aside,
So Joe, yeah, what if he said like, hey, Platonism is more probable, or things would be less surprising on Platonism? Like that'd be one way to go instead of saying there's just insuperable, there's
I know
problems.
the objections are in Super Bowl, and meanwhile, his objections, many of them, his objections to Platonism just like demonstrably misrepresent Platonism. They
Yeah,
like show blatant like confusions about terminology and so on. It's like, okay, dude. I mean,
yeah,
but yeah.
yeah,
Anyway, back to my numbering. So
yeah.
I kind of cut out those cringy premises, and
Mhm.
I put my own numbering on it. So 9, as I articulated it, was uh, if this one necessarily existent intellect were not also omniscient in the stronger sense that it knows all contingent truths, then it would have unrealized potential and thus not be purely actual.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
you might want to start. We might want to start with premise 4. That's the earliest one where I jump ship.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah,
so premise 4 says that a necessarily existing intellect would be purely actual. Now I just think that that's just obvious. Well, I think it's obviously false. I mean, I'm just going to say that. I
yeah,
think there are insuperable problems for that. No, I'm kidding. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, why? No, a necessarily existing intellect would not have to be purely actual. It could have potencies for cross-world variance. That is, it could have potentials to vary across worlds. Maybe in one world it performs one act of creation, and in a different world it performs a different act of creation. That doesn't mean that the being doesn't exist in one of the worlds. It could still
yeah.
be necessarily existent and have accidental properties. So
Right.
its essential properties, yeah, those of course couldn't have any potency, but it could still be a necessary being, even though it has some potentialities for cross-world variance, so long as those are potentialities for accidental variance across worlds. So
Yeah.
this
Well, Joe,
premise,
what about I mean, it seems like a lot's baked in here because he's classical theist, right? Dude's Catholic and he takes it very seriously. But like tensed ideas, tense thoughts, like if that is an accidental change or whatever in God, which is it's not essential if God has a tensed true thought, a tensed belief. If that is the case, then that would be potential, right? Like, but it's not an essential change. So it seems like if that's possible at all, then you can have a necessary being who can have potentiality,
yeah, even in principle, right? I mean, like, Fraser's trying to argue, like, in principle, from the armchair, like, you couldn't have
right?
a necessarily existent thing that isn't purely actual. And
Yeah,
to me, that seems clearly false,
yeah,
for the reasons that we've been adumbrating. So, yeah, anyway, that's premise 4. What was the next one that I targeted? Was it 9?
yeah. It's 4,
Okay.
9, 7, 11.
Oh, okay. Let's do 7 then. So, oh yeah, 7 was an intellect in which the interlocking system of ideas in question would be conceptually omniscient.
Yeah.
So, well, one thing I say against this is like, Fazer has essentially just argued that abstract objects correspond to ideas in the mind of God. That's
Hmm.
really all that he's gotten us. He hasn't gotten us to knowledge of said ideas. All he's
Yeah.
got, again, like, it might seem like natural to say, like, yeah, well, if there are ideas in a particular mind, yeah, then the mind would know them. But like, he needs to show this, right? He needs to
Yeah.
demonstrate why this thing would be not only having the ideas in the mind, but let's say taking some kind of intentional belief-like stance toward them, and also in some sense, maybe forming that belief reliably. I don't even know what the conditions are for God's knowledge, but whatever.
Yeah.
He hasn't shown that it's conceptually omniscient. He's just shown that the ideas are located, as it were, in the mind. You need to do more work to show that the being in question has knowledge of those ideas. Merely from the fact that something is located in another thing, or that something's located in my mind, it doesn't follow that I have ideas of it. Now, of course, you could say, but God's omniscient. Yeah, but here, this is supposed to be an argument for God, so we're not having a pre-given conclusion that this is God. We're trying to establish omniscience in the first place, so you can't assume omniscience there. So anyway, I'm being brief for this because I know we want to get to the divine simplicity stuff. So
well, and I think that's a really good point. And even though, sometimes in these conversations it'll be like there's a necessarily existing mind, and this we all call God, and you take from Thomas, and it seems like that's a move that's happening here too, and saying like, well, they exist in his mind, so he knows them all, but maybe God doesn't have, maybe all of his thoughts aren't occurrent, and so maybe I don't know. It's weird, like you said, like what does it look like for God to know something, or does he have to have that in mind? Thinking about ourselves, like, is there something that's in my mind that I don't remember right now? Can we have suppressed memories? We don't want to say that about God, but like you said, just give us some kind of reason for thinking that now we have omniscience here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, really, at this stage in the argument, he's really only shown that there is some kind of mind, not God yet, and the mind is necessarily existent, and there are concepts within the mind. That's really like all we've gotten. And it's like, I don't even know if this is the sort of being that could have like propositional attitude like stances toward propositions and toward these concepts, like belief like stances. What if it's just the kind of thing that can't have those? I mean, I don't know. Again, we need some sort of justification for thinking this, right? The onus of justification here is on Phaser to convince us that the thing is omniscient.
Yeah, I've thought about that recently with various forms of panpsychism. So maybe, maybe there's this universal consciousness that doesn't have propositional attitudes, but can ground. If you need a mind, a necessarily existent mind, then there's different ways to do it, and they're usually. I don't want to argue for panpsychism, but Philip Goff has given a bunch of different types of priority monist, panpsychist views. So there's other things, like if there's another type of necessary mind, then maybe that mind can ground these things as well. So yeah, I think there's more to be done for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to write a paper toward a panpsychist conceptualism.
I totally. Yeah, I had this. I had too many things going, but I wrote a paper on that for Brandon Rickenbaugh. I still have to. I'll send it to you, man. Maybe we could talk more about it. That'd be fun.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so the next one was 9. This one will also be really brief a bit. As I numbered it, it says, if this one necessarily existing intellect were not also omniscient in the stronger sense, that it knows all contingent truths, well, then it would have unrealized potential and thus not be purely actual. So set aside the fact that he hasn't even gotten to purely actual yet, but set that aside. Let's assume that he has gotten to purely actual. It doesn't follow that if this thing were not also omniscient in the stronger sense that it knows all contingent truths, it doesn't follow that it would have unrealized potential. That would only follow if this thing were first capable of knowing contingent truths, right? If it's not even capable of knowing those, if its cognitive powers are necessarily confined or restricted to just necessary truths and so on, so it's omniscient with respect to the necessary truths, but not with respect to the contingent truths, and it is essentially such, well then no, potency does not follow upon its not having such knowledge of contingent truths, right? So go back to Aristotle's unmoved mover, right? Aristotle has this view of a purely actual being.
Just like thinking thought,
yes,
right?
It's like, thought. It is eternal, purely actual thought thinking itself. Aristotle actually argues this from almost like a kind of perfect being theology move. If I recall correctly, he basically says, like, if this thing were to even think about this sublunary realm of disgusting, lowly, imperfect,
constantly changing,
constantly shape shifting, and if it were to think of that would like soil its perfection, right? So what it is eternal self-thinking thought, and so this thing is like by nature unaware of like the contingent happenings going on in the world, and so this thing doesn't have unrealized potential. This is purely actual. It is purely actual self-thinking thought. It doesn't even have the potential. It doesn't even have the capability of knowing all these contingent things, because that would soil its essential and necessary and immutable perfection. So like Phaser has this premise just simply assumes that this thing has the ability to know contingent things, and that assumption is not something that Phaser has anywhere justified.
Yeah.
So that's yet another problem for this thing. And it's nice to contrast that with the traditional Aristotelian, like proper Aristotelian, is what Aristotle himself thought. It's nice to compare that with what Phaser wants to get out of this argument, which I don't think he can.
Yeah, that is really good. I wonder if there's something there too that you could ground contingent truths and propositions, as they are, in like the mind of the unmoved mover without him thinking about it, because then you'd have this unmoved mover as the metaphysical ground of propositions, and yet he is not omniscient in the sense that we want to say God is, and Phaser wants to say in this case. Yeah, that's interesting, man.
Yeah, I mean, we have the power to selectively direct our focus on particular thoughts and aspects of our own mind. And so who's to rule out that that could also be applying to the self-thinking thought?
Right. And so again, you'd have to have an argument saying, no, if this necessarily existing mind, all thoughts must be occurrent. And if you don't have that argument, then yeah, maybe we stuff that in the subconscious or something, wherever.
Yeah. Okay, so that was 9, and then I think what was it?
11.
Oh, 11. Oh, well, that's just what is purely actual must also be omnipotent, fully good, immutable, immaterial, incorporeal, and eternal. So I was just very brief on that in my video because I've addressed elsewhere basically all of Phaser's stage 2 inferences. I've addressed them on my blog, and I don't think I think pretty much all of them don't work. I think immutability does work, but that's pretty much the only one for him. So yeah.
Okay. So we can go around to simplicity here.
Yes.
Yeah. And this one's really fun because if the argument does go through, it seems like it might be adding complexity to God in a way that Phaser doesn't want to say.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially what I want to argue is that it seems plausible that the Augustinian proof delivers a being that, if existent, or delivers a God that, if this is really how God is like, then divine simplicity, as traditionally articulated, is false. So what is divine simplicity? Well, you ask 13 different philosophers and you'll get 15 different answers for that one. So, but anyway, at least under the traditional version, the traditional strong version of the doctrine of divine simplicity that I'm working with here, it says that whatever is in God is God. Okay, everything intrinsic to God is identical to God. You can see this in W. Matthews Grant, in Jeff Brower, in Kate Rogers, in all the Hughes. I could go through all these different citations. Bill Vallicella, he says this in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on divine simplicity. Augustine himself said that God is whatever he has. So if God has something, he's identical to that thing. Anselm said, you are the very life by which you live. You are whatever you are. He's saying there that whatever we are predicating of God as he is in himself, God is that. He is wholly that. He is identical to that. So this is rife within the classical theistic tradition. No one is pulling this out of thin air. This formula, whatever is in God is God, that's the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity. You even have James Dolezal writing a book with the title, All That Is in God. That is in reference to the formula, all that is in God is God. Okay, so anyway, that is divine simplicity, as we use it here at least. None of this watered down, oh, well, he can have like these sorts of parts. There could be something intrinsic to God that's distinct from him. No, off to the gulag. Okay? So anyway, that's the traditional divine simplicity that we're working with here.
Well, and because that's the one Phaser is working with, right? So even if you were to play different games and like separable parts, inseparable parts, like Phaser's not using that language because he does want to affirm the maximal doctrine of simplicity.
Yeah, the high octane version.
There it is.
Essentially. Okay. So yeah, that's divine simplicity. Now the problem is, you've got God with all these concepts, like all these propositions, like the proposition that 1 + 1 = 2 is different from the proposition that I exist. Okay, one of them is contingent, the other one's necessary. They're different from each other. And if we want to be realists about these things, we have to say that there are such things. They exist. They're in reality. To say that there are no such things as these propositions is to adopt anti-realism. And yet Phaser precisely argued against that in his various insuperable arguments against insuperable arguments against these sorts of anti-realist views. Okay, so yeah, that's so we have to be realist about these sorts of things if we want to preserve the Augustinian proof.
Yeah.
But so these things exist. Moreover, I think it's just crystal clear to my mind. To my mind, it's crystal clear that at least some such things are distinct from one another. The universal humanity is numerically distinct from the proposition that 1 + 1 = 2. Propositions can't be like instantiated or whatever, or like inherent things, but like the universal humanity can. So like there's another difference. I think contingent propositions are different from necessary propositions. I think that abstract mathematical objects like triangles are different from numbers. The number 2 is different from the number 3. The number 3 is different from the number 4014, and so on. But yet there are such things, right? That's realism. So there are things which are such that they're distinct from one another. They're numerically distinct from one another.
Yeah.
And yet, per the scholastic realist view, they are intrinsic to God. They are in God's mind. Okay? So it is false that whatever is in God is God. The is of identity there.
Yeah.
Because we have things that are intrinsic to God, which are numerically distinct from God. Something like the number 4, or maybe that's a divine concept, but the divine concept of 4 is different from the number 2 because they have different things are true of each.
Yeah.
So that's the basic problem. The basic problem is, hey, if divine simplicity is true, then whatever is in God is identical to God. But if we want to have a realism, a scholastic realism, it's going to be the case that there are some things intrinsic to God that are not identical to God, like the number 2 and the number 4 and the proposition that 1 + 1 = 2 and so on. Hence, divine simplicity is false if we want to hold on to this scholastic realist view. Again, for the audience, I don't claim that this is insuperable, or that there aren't ways to get around this, and I don't think we should be using arguments as weapons meant to attack others. Rather, we use them as tools to try to serve debates, to try to serve our intellectual and our dialectical opponents, as it were. We should be serving each other with our arguments and being on the same team, trying to use them to probe the fundamental nature of reality and trying to get at truths that matter, right? And we're trying to serve each other with these truths. And so we're not using these to kind of bash down the divine simplicity theorist or whatever.
Right.
No, we're on the same team as the divine simplicity theorists. We're trying to get at the fundamental nature of reality, and let's do so with maturity and love and respect and a mutual orientation towards the truth. So,
yeah, that's a great point, man. Yeah, it is, especially because we were going so hard on the insuperability stuff. But it's philosophy, guys. This is something that my theology.
I just want to say the reason I go so hard as that is precisely because I value this sort of service, using arguments as tools, not weapons that you say you have insuperable, knockdown, decisive things that remove other people from the debate. Okay,
right.
That is. Anyway, I think that there are more mature and sophisticated and more loving views that you can take towards philosophy that are service oriented and truth oriented, rather than that kind of polemics and knocking down oriented. So it's precisely because I value that kind of service oriented philosophy that I will harshly criticize the kind of use of these other, like, oh, it's insuperable and all that sort of things. So anyway,
you almost went into your Swinburne accent there, but
he used to say.
Well, you mentioned simplicity, so the chat or whatever, the comment section right now is not going to be very charitable because people are going wild, I'm sure. People do not take simplicity lightly. So so this is actually, I'm glad you said that about arguments, because this is one of the main reasons why I am not super heavy on simplicity, because I like conceptualism a lot. I think it's great. And so I lean way more on conceptualism. So I'm like, I just don't see how it can make sense with simplicity. So if one's got to go, I'm going to go with simplicity. Brian Leftow, he does this weird move where he's like, well, no, propositions and abstract objects are concepts in God's mind, and concepts are what does he say? A facon de parler or whatever. It's like a way of speaking. And he doesn't translate either, which is funny because it just stays there as if we all know that. I had to Google it and be like, what is he talking? I knew what he meant, but I didn't know the direct. It's like a way of speaking. So he's like, they're concepts in God's mind, but not really. Like, so if you think that I really mean it's a genuine concept, I don't mean that. And you're like, well, Brian, man, like, what are you talking about?
By realism.
Yeah, right. And so he says that they're mental events. And so I thought this was interesting about Phaser. He identifies his position with, he says it's basically Welty's theistic conceptual realism. But man, that's kind of a lot to bite on. Like, you can just say it's divine conceptualism, because then you'd have Leftow to choose from, you'd have Welty, you'd have Paul Gould, you'd have the different theistic activists. But to say it's the realism, now you're committed to saying these are real objects. Leftow says they're not real, it's just mental events. Do you think that his I'm putting you on the spot here with Leftow, but if we were to go the anti-realist route and say these are mental events, and would that help us with simplicity? Any just thoughts pop up about whether or not that can secure simplicity and a form of divine conceptualism?
Yeah, what's difficult is that what makes this difficult is that I haven't looked at this particular portion of Leftow's work. I love
Yeah,
Leftow's work. It's kind of reminds me of Proust's work. It's kind of technical, and I really like it for that
yeah,
reason. uh, and I think it's pretty innovative. I like Proust's work also. I like it
yeah,
for that reason. So I got a huge respect for Brian Leftow. But so I'm just going to comment on the view that you've specified here, and I'm not going to
yeah.
make a claim about what Leftow himself says. I'm not saying that I don't trust you.
No, dude, I don't trust
Yeah,
me. I wouldn't trust. Look at this book is very thick, everyone. Just so you
yeah.
know, it's
It's
stupid.
like 8 C's. It's got like 8 C's thick, maybe even 9. It's bordering
it
on 9.
it's unreal. And this is a portion where he has said himself, I don't have time or space to say what I'm about to say. And then he says it. So even if I did say it right, it's not his fleshed out full
Yeah.
thing, even though it kind of is.
Yeah, I mean, I remember because when I was writing this chapter of my book, I needed to, go to different sources like Anderson, Welty, and so on,
Hmm.
and Menzel and so on. And I went to his, and I remember looking, but this is, like a year ago or something when
Right.
I like looked at it. So I totally forget what Brian Leftow said in there. But on what you said, I mean, are there more than one such events?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
know.
are there two such like maybe he wants to say that there's one event, mental event, and it's such that it has the infinitely many contents that are the what the theistic conceptualist identifies with the infinitely many abstracta. But like that just pushes the problem back a step. I'm going to go to those contents and I'm going to say, what's their ontological status?
Right.
Are there such things as these contents? If there are, then you've got the things intrinsic to God that are distinct from God. If there aren't such concepts, then you've adopted anti-realism. You've denied that there is such a thing as the number 1 and the number 2 and the number 3 and the number 4 and so on. So like, I don't know, there seems to be this fundamental dilemma. Either
Yeah.
there are such abstract objects or there aren't. If there are, you're going to have things intrinsic to God, distinct from God. If there aren't, you've got anti-realism.
Yeah.
So like that's the fundamental dilemma. Now, some people try to get around this dilemma by like positing different modes or ways of being, like
Yeah.
different, like the spooky. Well, I say spooky. That's my derogatory term. This kind
Yeah.
of spooky conceptual existence, and that's different from like real existence or something. Somehow.
But let's just bring Meinong back. We're just Meinongian. This is fine. Just multiple ways of being.
Yeah. So like something doesn't really exist, but it exists conceptually. Okay. So like, are there these concepts? Well, you have to say there is no such thing as this, generic R, like the
Yeah.
generic existence. You have to say, are there sub conceptual such things? Yeah, but are there sub real such things? No. So anyway, that gets into
Yeah.
ontological pluralism, ontological monism. I think
Right.
there are some by my lights powerful arguments for monism, but even setting that aside,
Yeah.
um, I don't think that this sort of move works. I mean, firstly, I do struggle. I mean, I have to admit that I do struggle to get a grip on what this distinction amounts to: conceptual existence versus real existence. And it's okay. So I guess I should spell out how this is purported to help the
Hmm.
classical theist here. So the idea is that, well, when we're saying that whatever is in God is God, we're saying that whatever is really in God is God. Like whatever really exists that's intrinsic to God
Yeah.
is identical to God. But the thing is, these sorts of abstract objects that exist in the mind of God, because they're conceptual items or whatever, they don't really exist. They just conceptually exist.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's not a threat to divine simplicity. It's not a threat to that formula that I just gave. Whatever
Yeah.
really exists that's in God is God. It's not a threat if you have, as it were, multiple things that conceptually exist in God, right? That's not a
Yeah.
threat to not immediately a threat to that thesis. Um, Now, I don't know. I find this difficult. Firstly, because it's not clear to me what this distinction amounts to, right? I mean, like when we say that, like we classical theists often talk about real relations and like mixed relations, or sometimes they're called like conceptual relations. But like God doesn't bear real relations to creation in the sense of like, hey, had God not been so related, God would have been different, or
Right.
God doesn't instantiate some polyadic relational property that kind of latches him on to creation, as it were.
Yeah.
So instead, God's relations to creatures are conceptual. They are, and how we kind of cognize and represent and speak of God.
Yeah.
But in that case, right, we're not going to be citing these conceptual relations to do metaphysical explanatory work, precisely because it's like it's in our minds, right? It's
There's
in our
nothing
minds.
to them. They don't
Yeah.
have real, whatever that real existence
Yeah,
is. Yeah.
when we ask what explains why creatures exist, we're not going to say because God is related to them in such and such a way, because these aren't real relations. They are
No.
conceptual relations that exist in our mind. So it's
It'd
like
be like it's like a, I don't know if it's a category error, but it's like, well, why? It's like positing Bilbo Baggins as a explanation for something, why the table is here or something.
yeah,
It's like, well, it's not that kind of thing if he is only conceptually exists.
yeah, exactly. And so like I don't think that if you take this conceptual existent route, I don't think you're going to be able to preserve. It's like you're kicking the ladder out from under you. You got to realism in the first place by positing these abstract objects that do certain metaphysical work in your ontology.
Yeah.
But if later on you're forced to kind of give up, as it were, their robust reality, and instead just say they have this kind of conceptual existence, it seems as though you are removing yourself from that explanatory work that they were supposed to do. Now, of course, you still have God, and God really exists, and God's able to cause these sorts of things.
Mhm.
But the realist arguments were not citing God. Otherwise, they'd be theistic
No.
arguments.
Right.
They were citing the abstract objects themselves that explain, say, objective resemblance, and
Yeah.
that explain the truth of subject-predicate discourse, and that explain, these other sorts of things. So it's just difficult for me to see how you could preserve the very arguments that got you to realism in the first place, which in turn served as a stepping stone to you getting to the theistic conceptual realism. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that I want to say in response to that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it still seems to me that, are there such concepts? Just like, let me just define a minimal sense of are. Like, is it true that such things are in reality? Or like, is it
Yeah.
true that is something true of them? Right? Is something true of them? Are they there? I don't know how else to say it. If they are there, then there are more such one. There's more than one of them, and so there are some kind of reality. Maybe it's even conceptual reality, but like that in itself might seem to pose a challenge to this classical theism. If there is something that is not numerically identical to God, that's in God, well, then you have uncaused things that are distinct from God. Like you have all these worries to aseity and so on, all these things that push the classical theist to adopt divine simplicity in the first place. It seems as though you're kicking that ladder out from under you as well, because even if they have conceptual existence, whatever that means, there are still such things, even though they might conceptually be there, and they're distinct from God. And so you have these uncaused, non-God things. Like, oh my goodness, like that's a red flag, right?
Right.
Well,
so I think another thing with Leftow, I believe, again, Dr. Leftow, if you want to come on, please do. He did turn me down like a year ago or whatever. So that's your fault. Now I get to misrepresent you.
Well, that was when probably that was early in the podcast.
That's right. Now I'm somebody. So he says that they're mental events and they're concrete, because they're causal, but they're concrete because they're uninstantiable. And when he said that, I was like, well, aren't these supposed to be multiply instantiable?
Yeah.
Like, and they're supposed to be abstract. Like exactly what you said, that you're starting to, like, the rungs that I've climbed up to get to where your position is turn out to not, they're conceptual rungs, and I didn't actually climb up anywhere.
You conceptually climbed up.
Yeah, right. There you go.
But yeah, I mean, like, that's also a bit like, just for critical thinking, like a general pro tip, right? Like, oftentimes, this is a human thing. Like, we use certain arguments to get to certain positions, but then, like, when certain objections afflict those positions, we kind of modify or I don't know, we make certain tweaks and we adopt certain responses to those objections. But sometimes we fail to see that those responses undermine the very reasoning that we took to take us to that position in the first place.
Right.
And so, it seems to me that some of that is arguably going to be going on here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to look at some of the other, because I have like 4 or 5 responses in my book manuscript to this conceptual existence thing, and I think we've only gone through like 3 or 4 of them, and so on. But anyway, I think that's enough. It's
Yeah.
firstly, it's hard to see how they can do the explanatory work. Secondly, even if they have conceptual existence, you seem to still be threatening divine simplicity. There are
Yeah.
because all the motivations that took someone to adopt the divine simplicity, that whatever is in God formula, you're still going to be having these uncaused, somehow existent. Maybe they're just conceptually existent, but they're still non-God,
Yeah.
uncaused things. That's a big red flag, and so on, and like necessarily existent things that are non-God. Uh, and so yeah, and I think the biggest problem is really just that metaphysical explanatory thing. Like they don't, you're not going to cite God's relation to creatures to explain why there are creatures, because such relations are not real relations.
Right.
You need to they need to really exist in order to be able to metaphysically explain something. And so if you're denying real existence of such things, I think it's plausible that you're going to face difficulties with their explanatory work, which is precisely what we use to get to realism.
Yeah. Right, dude. And I think that is I just think it's such a big deal for simplicity. Like, if you take this argument serious, if you're a divine conceptualist of any stripe, you got to do more work on saying how this does not explode simplicity. Like, you really, someone needs to write that. Other people I know have said, look, I used to like that argument, but I see that it's messed up simplicity, or it does, so I can't use the argument. And I just am on the other side of that, where I'm just like, well, no, I hold this argument in higher regard. So if you're listening right now, folks, do the work and show me. Like, I would love to see that. I would love to see how we can get around this. I don't see it right now, and Joe
I
doesn't
should
either.
say, like, I'm not the only, of course, like, as you just pointed out, I'm not the only person who has pointed out this potential tension. And of course, there are, things that certain people say. Like, I've even heard people say that precisely, like, authors in the literature I'm talking about, I've heard them say that because they accept divine simplicity, they do in fact say, yeah, there's only one such thought, and there's only
Yeah.
one such concept, and yeah, that is God. And I'm just going to be like, well, then, goodbye realism. I mean, I want
Yeah.
to say that the number one exists, and so does the triangle that exists, and so does the Pythagorean theorem, and so does this other proposition, and so on. And if anything is distinct from one another, these things are distinct from one another.
Yeah.
You know, so and they have to be distinct from one another in order to play the particular explanatory role. Well, anyway,
Well, and that really is the problem, right? Because that is how we got. That's the rungs. Those are the rungs of the ladder that we climbed up. So they really do need to play that role, and you can't. Once we get to the end, you can't pull the wool out from under the rug out from underneath us and say, "Surprise, surprise! This whole time, the number one is just the number two."
and
Like,
which is the universal humanity, which
right,
is the Pythagorean theorem, which
right,
is the proposition that I exist, which is the proposition that 1 + 1 = 2. It's
yeah,
like, what?
yeah. If
If anything
someone
is false, that's false.
there, the one thing I can think of right now is just like light and the prism. It's on everyone's cover and everything. It turns out that like blue and white and all those things are in the white, are blue and red and green, and everything is in the color white. But that's not, I mean, that's an analogy. It's
Yeah.
not, yeah, it's not this,
I still
but
think
this,
there's that fundamental dilemma. Are there such things? And are they distinct? Like, we just
yeah,
have to ask those two things. If you want realism, yeah, there are going to have to be such things.
yeah,
That is what realism is. To say that there are no such things, they really are there.
yeah,
That's what the realism portion is. That's what we argued to at the beginning.
yeah,
So we're kind of granting that. We're setting aside the nominalists because
yeah,
there are apparently insuperable objections to them. And so once we do that, then we have to ask, are they distinct from one another?
yeah,
And yeah, they are.
yeah,
So like that's the problem. And yeah, I mean, some people try to have their cake and eat it too. So Alexander Proust in his book, it actually might be behind me. No, I took it to college and it's still there because I really like the book. It's the book Actuality, Possibility, and Worlds. I
yeah.
really enjoy it. I love that book so much. He convinced me to at least lean towards a causal powers view of modality. So
Okay,
um,
nice.
yeah, along with like Oppie and Malpass and Josh Raphelson's sympathetic to it and Rob Coons. And anyway, it's
Yeah,
kind of the fad nowadays.
that's
No,
right.
I'm
Yeah,
kidding.
and they're all super smart. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So good company. But anyway, yeah, that book, he tries to do a marriage between. I'm not down with his marriage. He tries to do a marriage between. So I object. He tries to do a marriage between Aristotelian powers view of modality and a kind of Leibnizian divine conceptualist view.
yeah,
And so he says that like possible worlds are like maximal consistent or perhaps maximal compossible collections of ideas in the mind of God or something along those
hmm,
lines. And of course, Proust in that book, he's like, well, crap, I accept divine simplicity, and there's more than one possible world. I just spit on myself. There is more than one possible world, right?
Yeah.
And so there gonna have to be more than one such collection of possible consistent ideas in the mind of God. How am I going to score that with my divine simplicity? And at least by my lights, he seems to be trying to have his cake and eat it too. Because what does he go on to say? He goes on to say that uh, these things are not fundamental. Yeah, they're there,
Yeah.
but they're non-fundamental. They're grounded in the more fundamental and simple and unified reality of God, or something along those lines. And I'm
Yeah.
like, dude, I mean, come on. Like, you just denied the claim that whatever is in God is God. I don't care if they're non-fundamental. They're there,
Yeah.
okay? No one cares if they're non-fundamental. Well, I mean, I think that really, arguably, I mean, this is what the non-classical theists have urged us all along. You don't need divine simplicity. You could just say that there's one fundamental thing, God, and God grounds God's various aspects or whatever, or his parts,
Sure.
quote unquote parts. So,
Yeah.
like, anyway, again, what he tries to do is just say that, hey, they're not fundamental. And I'm like, that doesn't matter. What matters is that they're there. Okay, you have
Yeah.
things that are intrinsic to God, distinct from God. That's what's the problem, not whether or not there are fundamental things intrinsic to God, distinct from God. So, like, it seems to me that he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. And anyway,
Yeah, I had a similar experience because I got it secondhand in the T&T Clark Handbook of Analytic Theology. I can't remember her name right now, but one of the contributors, she wrote about
is it Lauren
divine.
Keller?
No, she's in the other one. She's in Planning's book.
She's in 2 dozen or so. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, it's not Planning's, but yeah, about it's way over there, dude. I can't grab it, but I'm sorry. I wish I could give her a shout out, but yeah, she kind of quotes it. She did. She should come on, but she like chopped away at a lot of my friends and heroes in a really quick way. And then she brought up Proust's, but I think she brought it from one of his blog posts. And it was just like, man, I don't get what's going on here. I don't see this. But also she wanted to hold on to, simplicity and stuff as well. So it's a tricky one. I want to see it. I would love to see someone do like a super good job. If it's gonna be like super good, maybe Proust can do it again. That dude's scary smart, super smart. But as it stands, man, yeah, I don't quite see it. But I want to move on to Anderson and Welty stuff. And Malpass's paper. So symmetry breaking is something I learned from you. I heard that word first from you in terms of ontological arguments. But there's this fun symmetry breaker problem here between the Platonist and the divine conceptualist. The conceptualist wants to say, the divine conceptualist wants to say, hey, look, we have parsimony because you guys have this whole other ontological category of propositions, but we just make those into thoughts. And we already have thoughts in our ontology. So here we are, like, we're one thing less. And so then by the rules of parsimony, which are king today in philosophy, everyone talks about, well, it's ontologically parsimonious. Then we win. So I've heard you talk about this and Malpass as well. You guys say, well, no, there's still 3 types of things for Frigga. He's got physical things, he's got thoughts, and he's got propositions. But Welty and Anderson have physical things, shareable thoughts, which function as propositions, and then contingent or private. Private's better. Private thoughts. So there's still 3 things, and so there's no symmetry breaker here. Does that sound right? Is a good summary?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the way that Alex Malpass responds to that, and I find his response plausible. I mean, it's what makes things difficult here is that it's hard to carve up categories of things. It's hard to carve up kinds of things.
Seriously.
Like, are you introducing a new kind of like uncaused thoughts versus caused thoughts? Because I know in Welty's incarnation, the thoughts themselves, I believe, are not caused by God. They exist in God.
Correct.
So, like, our thoughts are uniformly caused. So you're introducing yet another category. You've got uncaused thoughts, and we have caused thoughts down here. We also have limited and contingent thoughts, and we got necessary thoughts over here. And like, so I mean, maybe temporal and atemporal thoughts if you want to be a divine timeless theorist, and so on. So it's like, how are we carving out? That's one difficulty here, just with I guess both anyone who's trying to appeal to the kind of qualitative or categorical simplicity here, which is what Anderson and Welty want to try to do, is that how are we demarcating these categories, these fundamental ontological categories? I mean, that's one difficulty.
Well, Joe, real quick, what if someone were just to say, hey, look, we have the divine conceptualist has thoughts, and if we want to follow Frigga, because yeah, dude, carving up reality at its joints is really hard. But whatever, we have physical things, and then we have thoughts, and thoughts are a broader category that can include necessary thoughts, shareable, private. Why is that not like an appropriate move? And then saying, look, since we have these two categories, one can be subdivided a ton, but still just two, and the Platonist has three. Well, I'm sure there's something wrong with that move, but
Yeah, I guess I don't quite see that the force of that move, right? So suppose that I posit something that seems to be entirely categorically different from everything else we believe in. Maybe it's like a, I don't know, like a non-spatio-temporal, I don't even know, but let's just call this thing Bob, right? So I'm positing Bob. It seems to be in a completely fundamentally different category, but like, then I say, oh, hold on a second. There's this higher order category in which both Bob and all the other things that you guys, non-Bob believers, countenance. And yeah, that's a perfectly kosher single category. And so we both just have the single category. I just subdivide it, and I have some further subdivisions, okay?
yeah,
So like, that's not going to help, right? You're adding these, I don't know, these further subdivisions which aren't reducible to like the broader single category or the other categories. So you've still got these subdivided categories, which
yeah.
are irreducible fundamental categories. It
Mm.
doesn't matter if you can kind of locate it within some other higher order category that maybe we both countenance, or that, I don't know. I think that it's the mere fact of having a kind of primitive or perhaps irreducible or fundamental category, whether or not it's a subcategory um, of one that you're already having in your ontology. The point is that you're
Yeah,
bringing in the new ones, right? You're
yeah.
bringing in the uncaused thoughts, even though yes, you have the category of thoughts, and that's fine. But the worrisome addition is this new category of thought. It doesn't quite matter if it's subdivided under one other thing in your ontology. What matters is that it's a fundamental, irreducible kind that you're introducing.
Yeah.
That's what it seems to me.
Well, so what if we did that with persons and we said, God's a person and we're persons? Would that be too much of a stretch as well to sit, because you say, well, typically most people think, unless you're Swinburne, that God's a necessary being, or so there you have necessary persons. Is it the same kind of thing where we say, no, you don't get to sneak God into the category of persons if you're carving up the joints?
Well, you do get to have them in that category. It's
Okay.
just for when we're counting up parsimony, when we're counting up qualitative and categorical parsimony, it seems to me that what we need to be counting is like the fundamental, irreducible kinds of things of your ontology. And so whether or not there's this category that you're placing within an already existent category, and both of our ontologies say, the fact is that you're bringing in still further subdivisions, which themselves correspond to uh, unanalyzable, irreducible fundamental categories themselves, even though they're
Yeah.
subcategories of something we already countenance. So it's fine. Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to like include it under the subcategory of thoughts. But
Yeah.
what's worrisome for the parsimony consideration is that you're further subdividing it with more fundamental categories and so
Yeah.
on. That seems to me to be what's problematic. And I mean, for
Yeah.
me, right? For me,
Yeah.
um, I didn't take in my chapter Malpass's route. I mean, I did quote it and I didn't challenge it because I do think it's plausible.
Sure.
What I said is like, okay, fine, yeah, Platonism does, by dint of its non-spatio-temporal abstracta, it does have like a sui generis, irreducible or fundamental kind of object in its ontology, but Platonism doesn't automatically have a sui generis fundamental kind of object of a different sort, namely God, right?
God.
The
Yeah.
theistic conceptualist has an unlimited, necessarily existent, like probably timeless, perfect supernatural being. That's a pretty big honker in your ontology, right?
Yeah.
And that brings in loads of primitive vocabulary that you need to describe it, loads of primitive principles. You have to talk about the relationship between this thing and the world, and the relationship between this thing and all of its thoughts, and so on. It raises lots of parsimony challenges that the
Yeah.
Platonist doesn't have. The Platonist does have the sui generis extra fundamental kind, but by the same token, the theistic conceptualist is positing this sui generis fundamental kind of thing, namely God, supernatural, falls into a whole host of new new kinds of things, like supernatural, necessarily, unlimited, and so on. So
Yeah.
um, that's what struck me as implausible about their appeal to parsimony. I'm like, there seems to be a parity here. There seems to be
Yeah.
an equality. I don't know. Again, it depends on how you count up the kinds, but like, it's no mark against Platonism that they are positing this sui generis fundamental kind of thing when the theistic conceptualists are doing that with God as well.
Yeah. So, okay. So putting on my conceptualist hat, what if what if they were to say, well, there's an inherent ceteris paribus clause in simplicity charges, which everyone forgets today, and the positing God, even though he is a unique ontological kind, can explain or ground this whole category of sui generis on Platonist view, ontological kinds, which unlimited number of propositions. But if you can ground them in one thing, then you'd have like a qualitative parsimony instead of quantitative. And I'm using those words pretty loosely because that's part of my homework. I'm supposed to look up what those mean, so I'm using them without totally knowing.
Yeah, so well, I can just briefly say here. So like quantitative parsimony is just going to be like counting up the number of
Right.
entities in your ontology, whereas qualitative or categorical parsimony, as I take it,
Yeah.
there's controversy even how to like cast these things, but like
Right.
as I take it, it's the number of fundamental kinds in your ontology, like fundamental
Right.
in the sense of not reducible to other kinds. So it's like
Right.
you're gonna have to like bite the bullet and say that yeah, there is this fundamental irreducible kind of thing. It's as
Right.
Anderson and Welty put it, a sui generis kind.
Right. So
So
in that, if the though there is this brand new crazy thing which is God, if all the propositions are actually his thoughts and can be grounded in him, couldn't the conceptual say, well, look, yeah, it's a crazy new category, but it's qualitatively parsimonious if you're some sort of modified theistic activist, then God created them. Welty would still be maybe on the hook because they're uncreated.
yeah, well, see, what I'm thinking, here's the dialectic, right? So Anderson and Welty say, hey, the Platonists are positing this sui generis fundamental kind of object, these non-spatiotemporal Platonic abstracta, right? And
Yeah.
so they've got the spatiotemporal realm of physical things and so on, but they've also got this non-spatiotemporal realm of necessarily existent abstracta. And all else being equal, we should prefer Anderson and Welty's view because they only have thoughts in the physical thing. I mean, they have God's thoughts, yes,
Yeah.
but they also have thoughts in the physical world. The Platonist has thoughts, the physical world, and the abstracta in the Plato's heaven, as it were. Now, what I want to say there is like, well, no, you don't get to say that you only have thoughts because you also have God as a completely different fundamental kind of thing that the Platonist doesn't have, right? So yeah, in some sense, there's a simplicity because there's a qualitative simplicity because you don't also, in addition to God, have all the Platonic abstracta because you kind of locate them within God and use
Yeah.
the resources of your theistic theory. But that's not the point. The point is that you have God in there as this fundamentally different kind of thing that the Platonist doesn't necessarily automatically have to have.
Right.
So like that's where the parity is. That's where the
Okay.
symmetry is. Both of them seem to have this kind of there's a kind of realm of immanence and a realm of transcendence. There's two categories, as it were. There's the realm of immanence, which is the spatiotemporal things that we knock up against in our everyday lives, both thoughts and physical things and so on. And then there's the realm of transcendence, which is the necessarily existent non-spatiotemporal Platonic abstracta in the case of the Platonist. And in the case of the theistic conceptualist, it's the necessarily existent unlimited supernatural God and so on. So like there seems to me to be a kind of, I don't know, a parity there, a parity with a T, a symmetry there with respect to at least qualitative parsimony. Now, in terms of quantitative parsimony, I actually think the Platonist view is probably simpler because for every abstract object the Platonist countenances, the divine conceptualist says, yeah, there is that abstract object, but also that
Plus one.
abstract object, yeah, plus one, God.
Yeah.
It's in
Plus
God's
one.
mind. So like quantitative parsimony seems to me favors the Platonist. I think they're a wash. They're tied on qualitative parsimony. So it's like,
Well,
I don't
so
know.
with qualitative parsimony, if the conceptualist said you have an unlimited number of ungrounded things, if we're just limiting ourselves to propositions, if there's an infinite number of those, whereas on theism, you have all those are grounded.
Yeah. So
There's
no, this would
one
be
there's one
explanatory
ungrounded.
power.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I take this to be an element of explanatory power, not simplicity.
Okay.
So at least as for how we were focusing on it just there, we were
Gotcha.
focusing on simplicity. And
Okay.
that might, what you give there might just be an element of explanatory power or maybe unification, but
Sure.
unification itself might be part of explanatory power and breadth and depth and so on.
Yeah.
But it depends on how you divvy those up. But I think that's a potentially good move, right? None of them are ungrounded for the theistic conceptualist, but it seems like maybe all of them or maybe a lot of them are ungrounded for the Platonist. Now, how I would potentially push back on that is that it's not clear to me that, well, so firstly, not all of them are going to be ungrounded on the Platonist scheme. So the Platonist is going to want to say that definitely there, well, I think a Platonist should say this.
Okay.
There are definitely going to be grounding relations between these sorts of things, like the axioms of piano arithmetic. You get the successor function and so on. From those, you kind of get all the natural numbers for free. You kind of generate them in this kind of
Okay.
iterative hierarchy, as it were.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're all grounded in some more fundamental, single, so pretty limited set of postulates and so on. And like to me, right? To me, it seems like you're also going to have that. I don't know, on the theistic view, like. You also have those axioms of piano arithmetic, and you have these same explanatory relations obtaining among the abstract objects within God's mind. And then it's, yeah, you go on to say further that those more fundamental principles are grounded in God, but it's like, how does that grounding go? Like
Yeah.
you can't just say God exists and then therefore get as some kind of entailment the axioms of piano arithmetic or something. Like, I want some kind of illuminating account there. How does
Well,
God
there's
really?
a insuperable argument some against the Platonists.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. But like, yeah, exactly. My worry is like, you can, this, I actually have this worry for things like the moral argument and so on, that
okay.
like sometimes there's a tendency for some theists to just slap a label onto
No,
God.
you're absolutely right.
They
You're
slap
absolutely
a
right.
label onto God, grounds X. And I'm like,
Yeah, and that concept fills in all the blanks for you and explains everything because
yeah,
God, well, of course, well, naturally God. And I'm a little sympathetic to it. I get why you do it, but personally, reading philosophy of religion for years, it's like, well, I would like to know how you're doing that though.
yeah. I want the explanatory stories. Give
Yeah,
me an account of how somehow God is getting us to these, what the Platonist takes to be the fundamental. Let's say there are like, let's just suppose that there are 4 fundamental postulates of piano arithmetic, and from those we get all the natural numbers grounded
yeah,
and so on for
sure,
free. Show me. I want the class. If the theistic conceptualist says that there's some more fundamental explanation for those for basic fundamental piano arithmetic axioms, I don't know. Show me what's this explanation. You can't just slap a label and say God grounds it, right?
yeah,
It's like in the case of morality. It's like oftentimes in the moral argument debate, the theist just slaps a label and says, "Oh, God grounds that." I'm
yeah,
like, "Oh, well, how?" Well, it's like, "Oh, well, it's nature." I'm like, how does his nature, like, give me some kind of account, give me some kind of story here that illuminates the phenomenon in question.
yeah,
Oftentimes, I'm not, some people do give such an account, but oftentimes it's just, it stops at that. It stops at, no,
right.
God grounds it. It's just, I call it label slapping. They're just slapping the label.
Well,
God grounds this. And like, I grant that, yes, grounding relations are, if you can have more in your ontology and so on, and have fewer fundamental things, I think that's a good thing.
right.
But you can't just go around slapping these labels on everything. Otherwise,
Yeah,
I could come up with some kind of single Platonic object and I just slap on it. Oh, well, it grounds all the other ones,
yeah,
right? So, like,
right.
I need to get I need some independent grasp of how, I need some kind of account, some kind of story as to how God grounds these things that the Platonist would say are fundamental. And I don't know. I'm skeptical that people have done that thus far in the literature. I'm not aware of it. There might be some, but like, how
Yeah.
does God get? How do you go from God or like bare theism to like these fundamental axioms of piano arithmetic or so on? Like, it's difficult for me to see that.
I
But
hear you, and I think something that's been I don't know if it's as frustrating, but a little bit frustrating is the move towards just abductive and surprise and in IBE like well it's for the moral argument we don't have to explain. I don't know the full story, but it's less surprising over on
Mhm.
this side that we have these moral truths. And you go, well, yeah, okay, yeah. But like I'm with you. Now, how do I understand that relation more? Like even I'm not surprised anymore. This is cool. But I still want to know. And so that has been something I think I don't want to say it's intellectually lazy. I think it's probably a good move and stuff like that. But I'm left thinking like you said, like we still need to know. And especially if we're gonna be truth seekers and we're gonna be trying to figure all this stuff out, we still gotta know like what is that relation? And okay, so I'm not surprised, but that's cool. I'm glad it does a lot of work, but we still need more. So I'm
Mhm.
with you. The I think Welty, being a realist, would say, well, they're uncaused, but they're still grounded in that they are thoughts and following planning thoughts go with thinkers, whatever that means. And so we still have I know what it means. Sorry, I don't want to like belittle or anything, but thoughts go with thinkers. So they're not free floating thoughts flying around like a proposition might be. They just go with thinkers. Like, what do you make of that move of saying like they're grounded in that these four propositions of piano arithmetic, God didn't invent them, they're basic whatever, but they have always inhered in his mind. Is that a grounding relationship? Is that still, they're still ungrounded just as they would be on Platonism, so we still have symmetry or symmetry plus one because we have God too?
Well, I mean, we can distinguish between grounding grounding the entities versus grounding the character of the entities, right? So
Right.
I grant, or at least I think there's an analog that yeah, okay, in some sense thoughts are non-fundamental, and under this, under the way that Anderson and Welty are thinking about it, thoughts are less fundamental than and derivative from their more fundamental minds that kind of harbor them, as it were.
Yeah.
So I can kind of see that as an explanatory story.
Okay.
All that's getting me though is a ground, it seems to me, of like the fact that these axioms of piano arithmetic, like it's the fact that they're thoughts which is being explained here,
Right.
not the fact that it's these axioms in particular, like with the content, their character,
Sure.
like why is
Right.
why is it this successor function the way it is, and so on. That just seems to have to be a primitive. That's not going to be able to be grounded in God's mind. I mean, you could slap the label on it, but then I want an account. I want a story. So it's like, yeah, I agree with you that there's some sense in which, yeah, thoughts naturally go with minds, and even if we can't spell out all the precise details there, yeah, there's still some kind of plausible grounding relation between thoughts and their thinkers. But it's like, I want to know about like the content there. Like, why is it these axioms of piano arithmetic? Like, how does that? How do you give an explanatory account of that?
Yeah.
It's that seems to be the it's the what's it called, the theistic conceptualist is going to seem to me to have to just be taken as primitive. But that's precisely what like the Platonist is doing. Now, I guess the Platonist doesn't have the existence of those entities grounded, whereas their existence is grounded. So like we distinguish between the existence and the character. Both of them have the primitive character. Both the theistic conceptualist and the Platonist have their character being primitive. But I guess what I said there implies that the theistic conceptualist does have a kind of grounding for their existence.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering is like, I agree. Yeah. Oh no, this is. So you can kind of give a nondescript way, like, oh yeah, thoughts are grounded in thinkers. But it's like, why are there even these thoughts that have this character? Like, yeah, I agree that.
Yeah.
So like even sorry, I'm thinking out loud, as you can tell from
No,
the audience.
this is why I love it, dude.
This is so good because we're both at
right.
the edge of our thinking, and we are thinking out loud. We are philosophizing live right here.
That's right. Well, and you can't give just the modal, the possible world account and say, well, they just are this way because they're that way in every possible world. And it's like, well, that's why though?
Yeah, I don't like
we
that.
still want to say more about that. Like Lewis wasn't right on this stuff. Like,
yeah,
you still have to give an account.
Yeah, grounding, there's also some sense in which like one thing is like metaphysically due to or owed to another. And so there's a kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of explanatoriness there that's not captured solely in terms of modality. So I agree with you there.
Well, Joe, did you come up? I'm showing my limited scope of reading here, but did you come up with the existence versus character grounding? Because that is like, that distinction is so unbelievably helpful for these conversations.
I don't think I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, I've heard that language used. I mean, I certainly have not seen this used in the theistic conceptualism debate stuff.
This is huge. That's so unbelievably helpful, dude, because that's what a lot of people are arguing for, the existence. And they're saying God's mind is the grounding of the existence of these propositions. And then others, like if you're a theist, if you're a theistic activist, then you owe us a story for the grounding of the character. If you're a theistic conceptual realist like Welty or Anderson, well, you're a little bit of like a ostrich Platonist a little bit, and saying they just are that way, dude, and the buck's got to stop somewhere.
Yeah.
But I still have the grounding of the existence. And it's like, well, okay, that's cool. And I actually liked it. I actually think that's super duper powerful. But like, what you're pressing is the character. And I think that's still really important.
Yeah. And I mean, I've started to even second guess myself on the existence one. So it's like, I grant that if we say that there are these axioms of piano arithmetic and their thoughts,
Mhm.
yes, then we can ground their existence in God. But it's like, how did you get to there being these things in the first place, right? You
Yeah.
can't go merely from God and God's a mind. You can't go from that to saying that there exist even the existence, not just the character, but the existence of there being such axioms of piano arithmetic, whatever their character happens to be. There doesn't seem to be any obvious entailment relation there. So I still want an explanatory story.
Yeah.
It's not enough to say that God is in mind, because that alone is not going to get you to these things.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with the theistic conceptualists that, like, hey, if you have these things, and if they're thoughts, then you'll be able to ground their existence in there. But I want to know how you have those things in the first place. How are they
Yeah.
even there? So I'm actually second guessing what I said earlier. I think that arguably, even an existential grounding, it's not clear to me that the theistic conceptualist has an advantage over the Platonist when it comes to their existential grounding. I still don't know how to go from God to there even being the axioms of piano arithmetic in the first place. That seems to be something primitive. Now I grant that, yeah, once you have their existence, then you can go on to say, okay, well, yeah, they're thoughts, and those depend on thinkers. But it's like,
Right.
I still don't know how you got to their existence in the first place, and that is the kind of the existence grounding that I'm worried about. Now, there is some kind of distinction that I'd like to draw out here because
Yeah.
it's interesting because there are actually potentially what we've kind of uncovered here. There might be different kinds of uh, existential grounding. So we have character grounding, we have existential
Yeah.
grounding, but one of them is like, your theory makes it difficult to see how you could have such things in the first place. But if you pre-give their existence, then you kind of have like a story to tell about how they're grounded in your fundamental thing,
Right.
because they'd be thoughts. So there's a kind of distinction between like, how do you have the things in the first place? That kind of, I guess, primordial existential grounding. And then secondly, there's a
This is
kind of
getting
derivative existential grounding where once you have settled the question, even if it's just brute, even if you settle the question of their primordial grounding, they're primordially ungrounded, then you can go on to give a story as to how they, like, once you grant them, then you say that they're thoughts and thoughts are dependent on minds. So,
well, so Joe, what if we your the piano arithmetic is so good. It's such a good example because it presses the case. But what about like the law of non-contradiction?
well, okay, one before you
Yeah.
go on,
Yeah, yeah, please.
and I will turn it over to you. There are going to be some math nerds in the audience, and they're going to be like, they didn't characterize this correctly,
Yeah,
guys.
there are some math nerds that listen
This
for
is an
sure, actually.
example, okay? This is an illustrative example. Even if the details that we've gotten are wrong, all we need is some kind of example where we have certain foundational, perhaps principles or axioms that exist and that are taken as primitive, and that somehow ground a kind of infinite iterative hierarchy based on such principles. That's all that we need. Piano arithmetic, again, like, people don't get mad at us if we got the details wrong.
Right,
We
right.
might have gotten it right as well. I mean, I know that there are certain axioms, and you can get the numbers for free from certain of these when you have the successor function and so on. You have certain definitions. But anyway, I just
Yeah.
wanted to forestall the
Yeah, that's really good.
the
Thanks for
angry
doing
math
that.
nerd. Well, actually,
I have some of my favorite fans they've got their masters in mathematics, and I'm still waiting for them to teach me, but they're probably in the comments right now. Okay, so Joe, if we limit it to the law of non-contradiction, and we say that is a proposition, necessarily true proposition. So the Brentano problem is really interesting. I want to talk about that and a possible solution, but I'm going to jump ahead and say, if let's say the law of non-contradiction is a necessarily true proposition, Anderson and Welty are going to say that's a divine thought. So that would be it's existential grounding. And
primordial or no?
yeah,
Okay, so
right. No, that's
it's gonna be derivative existential grounding. The way that I characterize it, right? We have primordial. Why is there such a thing in the first place? And then the derivative existential grounding is, okay. Once we have the thing pre-given, we find that it has some character.
yeah,
In the case of theistic conceptualism, it has the character of being a thought, and then
yeah,
we can see how that can kind of fit within being grounded in or derived from other things that are already in your ontology. So we have
yeah.
the primordial existential and then the derivative existential.
So I think the primordial existential and the character grounding can, if we wanted to go with a truth maker theory and say the law of non-contradiction is a true thought about all of God's other thoughts, and if we right, so such that no thought can both be and not be true, or in the however we parse that, right?
Have you met JC Beale? No, I'm kidding.
That's right. Here he comes. Okay, so
He's everywhere
that's
and
right.
nowhere.
That's right. Principle of explosions out, so anything follows. Doesn't matter. So okay, so the law of non-contradiction. What's the truth maker for this truth bearer? Well, let's just say the divine nature. God can't contradict himself, and so, ooh, no good, no good.
No,
Is that
go on,
is,
go
is
on.
that slapping? Oh, so if the divine nature is
It
such
sounds
that,
like slapping to me.
okay, well, help me think through. I don't want to slap. The divine nature.
Why can't the divine nature, contradict itself? Because the
Well,
law of non-contradiction. Well, I don't know.
oh,
We might
no,
have.
no. So I want to have the grounding the other ways, because the law of non-contradiction is about other thoughts. None of his thoughts can contradict each other if thoughts are playing the same role as propositions, right? No proposition can both be and not be in the same way, in the same, right? It can't both be and not be about something or something.
Yeah. Well,
And
okay.
but then you could parse it if you wanted to say propositions are complex. This is what I really wanted to ask you about. I'm throwing a lot at you right now, but if so, Margolis and whoever else wrote the SEP article on concepts, there's like in that literature, they all say concepts are the building blocks of thoughts. And I'm like, all right, well, I'll just grab that. If that's the case, then God's thoughts, the thought P, not P and not P, that thought is about the divine concepts of negation and P, or thoughts, not both being and not being in the same way, in the same manner. So then we could give an account for the intentionality of God's thoughts. They're about his concepts. And it's structured. So propositions are structured and they're arranged this certain way because God's the arranger of his thoughts. So then we don't have this problem of why, we don't have the primordial problem, which we might have if we're Platonist, for why is it that this proposition is structured the way it is? If you're a structured theorist, or if you're not and they're just primitive, then why is Tibbles on the mat? Why is it not Matt on Tibbles or something? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I kind of like structured account. I mean, I kind of like Josh Rasmussen's account, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, so I just grabbed Josh's account in my paper and I just filled in the blanks with divine thoughts. So I like that you like Josh's account. That's really good. And I wanted to see if that works for divine thoughts. So a proposition on Josh's account is about these concepts which are about properties which are necessarily unique to the things that they're about. And so if properties are divine concepts, then we could just analyze this way and explain intentionality of divine thoughts. We could go one step further than the Platonist in accounting for the intentionality of propositions or things that function as propositions. What do you think about this? Is that
So, firstly, I like that move. I think it's interesting
okay?
because, well, I like it because in the discussion between Anderson
Yeah.
and Alex, it seemed to me that, well, I don't know, Anderson either wanted to say that these thoughts aren't about anything, or
Yeah. That's what he said.
something like that, and that struck me as that struck me as a huge no-no. So
I'll put a
this
pin in
sounds
that because I want to ask you more about that too. But
okay.
yes, I
This
get you, and
sounds like
that's why I wanted to go this way, because I also felt like that was weird, and we talked about it on Facebook chat or whatever.
and I think the reason why it's weird is because it's ladder kicking. It's the same ladder kicking that we saw earlier. Like, it's the intentionality of these things that was supposed to be. It's the intentionality of God's thoughts, which was supposed to be what's accounting for the intentionality of propositions. But then when you identify them, he goes on to say, "Oh wait, it's not actually about anything after all." So anyway, set that aside. Set that aside.
Yeah. I want to come back. Yeah.
Well, oh crap! I was just about to say something about
Rasmussen concepts.
Oh yeah. Well,
Properties.
your proposal. So okay, I hate to say it, but there does still seem to be a parity or a symmetry between them, because like you are explaining, you say that God's thoughts, which are the propositions, these are about something, and we can explain that, right? It's not primitive. It's essentially the same structure as Josh's
Yeah.
explanation of the intentionality of Platonic abstract propositions,
Mhm.
and it's in terms of an organization or a structure. But the thing is, how do we have the things within that structure being intentional, right? So Josh, what he does is he just says that, okay, it's sort of primitive in some sense, right? The properties are necessarily unique to the things.
Right.
And it's
Tibbles
kind of,
has, this
yeah,
property.
the property
And
being Tibbles
right.
and the property being the mat and so on. And so he kind of secures the intentionality there. And
Yeah.
that's a kind of primitive thing, right? We might wonder, like, why is it about that, right? Like, why is a property that's necessarily unique to Tibbles, why would that ground the intentionality being about Tibbles? Like, I don't know. You might wonder about that. But I think that ultimately that wonderment is probably going to have to bottom out in a kind of primitive intentionality. Like, yeah, okay, that's the end of my story. It's the end
But
of my story. But
yeah.
like that it's the end of Josh's story that this necessarily unique relation is tied to intentionality in the way that it is.
Yes.
But that seems to be what you're going to have to say. Like, why is God's concept, like, in virtue of what is that intentional?
Yeah. Right.
And
Well,
like,
so Joe, so I think I think you're right here, but I think I think the explanatory power might be on the side of concepts, because it seems like, well, concepts are about things. Are properties, do properties have intentionality? Is triangle about triangle things? Maybe we say it is, right? But
well, this actually comes into one of my objections to, like, the
okay.
theistic conceptualism. It's like, concepts are about things, but properties aren't about things. Therefore, properties aren't concepts.
Right. So it's the
Um,
latter thing again. We started off thinking that properties are not intentional, but now once we're to divine concepts, you want to say properties are intentional, dude. So surprise, surprise.
yeah, like, I mean, when I think about the property of redness, that doesn't seem to be about it. How would it be about
Yeah.
redness? I mean, it is redness.
Right.
Is it about all the red things? Well, no, because there might not have been any red things. And
Yeah.
like, well, so I don't know, like, so
Well,
redness seems to be, it doesn't seem to be intentional.
yeah.
But concepts, a concept is always a concept of something. It's
Yeah.
intentional. It's directed toward its conceptual content, right? And so it seems to me that it's just fundamentally misguided to identify concepts with properties, which is
Hmm.
what the theistic conceptualist seems to do. So I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing Anderson and Welty have something to say about that, but
Well, they
that
don't
seems to
make
me to
this
be,
move. I think that they don't make this move. Paul Gould doesn't make this move because he wants to say propositions are primitive. So Davis makes this move in a co-authored with Gould in Beyond the Control of God, and Morris, Menzel, I think they also make this move. So if we were to say that, okay, this and it's the whole time I'm running into like, well, that's ad hoc, dude. Nice job, like, clipping off stuff to fit your thing. But if Frege is right about concepts, then they are straight up universals. They're Phrygian senses or whatever, and so then maybe we don't have to worry about this intentionality problem of matching properties with concepts. And then we can say, well, how is it that these concepts give intentionality to the proposition or whatever? And you say, well,
that's primitive, it seems to me.
it could be the arranger. Like if God is the arranger, and Paul Gould kind of hit me with this and said it was kind of ad hoc, I think. But if thoughts are made out of concepts, why is it that this thought now is about Tibbles being on the mat? Because God arranged the concepts, which are the constituent pieces or whatever of the thought, such that they would represent Tibbles being on the mat. I recognize
Could you say that again? Sorry.
So you're gonna need an arranger if propositions are structured. They're arranged a certain way. On a theistic divine conceptualist view, God arranged them. So like the proposition Tibbles mat on the isn't intentional. It's not about it's nonsensical. It doesn't. But if it's arranged about Tibbles being on the mat, now it makes sense.
Yes.
And
Okay.
that's what Josh talks about in the book. Like the order matters as
Yeah.
well as the on relation and all that.
So I agree that you have an explanation of the intentionality. So yeah, let me say I agree that you have an explanation of the intentionality, it seems to me, of the proposition, because I
Yeah.
think that that's at least plausible in the case of Josh's theory. But like what I'm worried about is like the intentionality of those concepts, right? And that seems to be primitive, and like the same. So both the Platonist account and your account bottom in primitive intentionality. It seems to
Yeah,
me.
yeah. So if they do, then I would want to push and say like, well, even if there's symmetry again, maybe the explanatory power is on the side of the divine conceptualist because we have an explanation for the arrangement of that proposition.
So God did it. You're slapping the label. Well,
is that slave?
Yeah. So like, why? Like, why is God thinking? Why? How do you go from bare theism to that? I mean, like, yeah, okay, you could say God grounds it, but it's like, I don't know what. Why? How is there this thing there that God? I don't know. It seems to me to be label slapping again. I mean,
Okay.
maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. I mean, I could be
It
mistaken.
very well maybe. So
could God not have arranged anything? I mean, so like,
wait, what?
I mean, could God like have refrained from arranging it? Because arranging sounds kind of causal, but you might want to say that this is a non-causal grounding.
No, I think that I want to go with a causal route. I think the modified theistic activist account can take us a little bit further here. And so if we're sticking, this is why I wanted to go with the law of non-contradiction.
Hold on.
Yeah.
So now we're getting into the Ward problem. Sorry, Tom
This is
Ward,
good, dude.
He points out like God doesn't make things up out of thin cloth, right? I don't know. Like if God is causing these things, well then causally prior to doing them, that would seem to be unintentional actions, because he doesn't know what he's doing in advance. He doesn't have the kind of intentional thoughts and so on. Like what he's causing is precisely what's supposed to be accounting for the intentionality of his thoughts and so on in the first place. So if causally prior to that he doesn't have that, it seems as though you are not going to have this being like a knowledge-governed causal act and an intentional act. It just like Tom Ward. This is what Tom Ward was saying.
Yeah, you can't make. You can't make stuff up.
Make stuff up out of whole cloth, as it were.
Yeah.
That was his objection to Leftow's view, and I'm wondering if the view that you're sketching here has that worry as well.
It could, because, well, okay. Let me think. So, if we take Josh's view, then Tibbles, that concept is about Tibbles, one Tibbles. It's not like a unless the arrangement is what's extending the extensionality of that is by being arranged and tensed or whatever, right? So then no, that's not good. Okay, I am thinking out loud with you here too.
This is good. I mean, we're like doing like philosophy on the edge of the very edge of our thinking. So this is all kind of like innovative stuff, and like a lot of this stuff is also at the edge of the literature, right? Like a lot of this stuff hasn't even been worked out, like fleshed out in a fully worked out theistic conceptualist or modified activist theory. So for the audience, but like at some point, sometimes it just runs through my mind where it's like, maybe the nominalists are onto something.
No, I've thought about that too. And so has everyone else. All the conceptualists I talk with, they're like, dude, this is tough. Like, this is hard stuff. At some
point, we just have so many like working parts in our theory that I'm like, well, crap, man, nominalists might be onto something. And I don't know. I just wanted to say that I had that flash again. Just a moment ago.
If we go with the law of non-contradiction, we could. I don't want to be I don't want to be an exemplarist like Tom. I don't want to do that, but it seems like it does work in the case of non-contradiction. And immediately you go, well, what about a draft then? What about this or that? But if the divine nature is the truth maker for the truth bearer, which is the law of non-contradiction, which functions to that, then we have a solution to like voluntarism. Could God have made A and not A in the same way in the same time? Well, no, because it would be contradictory to his nature. He doesn't contradict himself. That's what makes that proposition true. So he couldn't have made it otherwise. And then you go, well, does that limit his freedom? Well, it only limits it insofar as he's limited by his nature. But then God has a nature, and so we might not go with simplicity and other concerns.
Yeah. Well, this might be a nice way to just transition into the problem of freedom, right?
Yeah.
I think this is a good transition. So anyway, I'll let you ask me what you want, if you just want me to lay it out or whatever.
Well, I want to do that one too. Oh man,
the non-valley thoughts.
Yeah, well,
I mean, listen, I'm really enjoying this conversation. Let's go. Yeah. We're at 1 hour and 30 minutes. Let's go for another 30 minutes. And so...
Awesome. Yeah. So real quick, I just wanted to talk about the intentionality again. So that I gave following Rasmussen. One thing about Welty and Anderson, if they want to say that, and Gould, propositions are simple, and you identify them with divine thoughts. Malpass has this great dilemma for them, but they're okay. But you say what makes these things intentional? What makes these thoughts intentional? What are they about? And Anderson goes, well, they're not about anything. You say, then they're not intentional. I wonder what about the proposition? What's the proposition about? For the Platonist, is it about something? Like, if it's not about something, but it's still intentional, then can't the divine thought just say the exact same thing? The conceptualist?
Okay, so that's a good question. When I think of the Platonist, I'm going to be thinking of Josh Rasmussen's Platonic account. And so
Okay.
the proposition is intentional, and it's about something. It's about Tibbles, it's about the mat, and it's about on. And in particular, at a fine-grained analysis, I mean, we can be coarse-grained and fine-grained.
Sure.
At a fine-grained analysis, it's about Tibbles being on the mat, right?
Yeah.
And, we can explain that aboutness in terms of the properties that make up the in their particular order within the organization or the structure.
And if that's the case, then I think you have gone a step further than the divine conceptualist who holds to a simple view of propositions, because you've given more a further explanation and saying here's what they're about.
Yeah, and I think it's important to see that it's not just a slapping explanation, right? Just slapping.
No, I don't think so, because I just use the same thing, right?
Yeah, and I think, Josh goes into detail about this, and it does see, the kind of organization of properties, like that does seem to kind of account for how there's that kind of intentionality.
Right. I didn't know you wanted to make that move. That's awesome. I did the same thing. That's really,
yeah. But like, if you have a simple view of thoughts, like, you seem to be facing this problem, right?
No, I think that's right, because then you have to just say, well, it's brute, and then if the Platonist says it's brute, well, then you go, well, yeah, but thoughts go with thinkers, and you have just, and now we're back to the same.
Versus derivative.
Right. That's good, man. I'm glad we both went further than the simple views. Then I like it.
It's a tentative.
Yeah. Right.
Again, like I'm not even fully on board with like Platonism about propositions, but
sure.
We're just operating on. Again, I like to I put on a Platonist hat, because that's what Anderson and Welty and so on are comparing in order to try to differentially support theistic.
Well, but Joe, that's what makes your stuff so interesting and fun, because you don't just go, but I'm a nominalist, so sorry. It's like, well, okay, this wasn't fun anymore. Like, great. So you had a stalemate right at the beginning, dude. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we got some of that. So you got these 4 problems with theistic or 4 theistic conceptualism. I call the first one body thoughts, because it's like one of the first in the list of Graham Oppie's. Then the second is that theistic conceptualism unduly restricts God's freedom and control. Then there's the bootstrapping worry, and the last one, compossibles, and the problem there. Joe, are all 4 of those going to be in the book?
Yeah, so I discuss all 4 of them in the book, and I don't defend all 4 of them. But I definitely discuss all 4 of them.
Awesome.
So yeah.
Well, which one do you think's the hardest or the most insuperable for the
most insuperable? That sounds like,
because now we're ordering our superability.
That sounds like being most pregnant. Like, I'm the most pregnant out of all of us.
Well, but there's bigger and smaller infinities in mathematics, right? So like,
true.
So maybe
that's true. Now we're bringing an infinity into this. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is also it's interesting to think about how all this relates to the Kalam cosmological argument as well, or at least the old Kalam, what I call the old Kalam, because, well, anyway, set that aside.
Yeah.
Because arguably we have actual infinities, but set that aside. Theistic conceptualism. So, yeah, did you ask me which one is the most? Okay, the most pregnant one out of all of them.
That's right.
It's certainly not the body thoughts objection or the ungodly thoughts objection.
Yeah.
I also don't think it's the counterpossible objection, although I think that one's at least more plausible than the ungodly thoughts objection. And so that leaves the middle 2 ones, which was the unduly restricting freedom and bootstrapping.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think those are equally challenging. So
okay. Well, let's go with bootstrapping really quick, because one of my professors and friends, Paul Gould, he's done work on at Purdue. He's done work on the
Boiler up.
bootstrapping problem, and I'm sure you're aware of his response in the Beyond the Control of God. So for those who don't know, the bootstrapping problem is how can God pull himself up by his own bootstraps? Doesn't really make any sense. If he has these properties if he has the property of being creator before he created, like what's the deal with that? Or if he has this property of thinking before he created the property of thinking, it's bootstrapping. Like what the
Or the
heck?
property being God or being divine or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So God has to create his properties. Morris and Menzel, or it might just be Morris, but they talked about like a 3D printer. And it's just like God's been 3D printing his own
I
nature
don't like
from
that at
eternity.
all. That I'm like, stop. Like that's what I just say. Stop. Like there's that GIF where it's like I know some people say GIF, but it's
Yeah,
GIF.
it's a GIF.
Anyway,
It's a GIF.
anyway, there's like a stop sign, and the guy's got like I don't know what it is, like a some kind of long stick, and he's just like tapping the stop sign. Stop.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't want to pull out the 3D printer one, but Paul Gould says, okay, here's how we do it. God's essential Platonic properties exist, I say, and substances are Aristotelian. So divine substance is a fundamental unity. It's a final cause of its constituent metaphysical parts. He doesn't go for simplicity. Says, it's Aristotelian, so he's got non-separable parts, even though he's made of parts. What do you think? Have you given any thought to this before, Joe?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is like the standard, what the classical theist is going to want to say in response. It's like, you can't have ase properties. God's supposed to be the only thing that's ase.
Yeah,
the
right.
only thing that's uncreated.
Mhm.
You can't have non-God existing things that are uncreated and ase.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
raise the flags. That's a red flag.
Yeah.
But that's one thing that I want to say. And like, there's some plausibility to that. I don't know, like perfect being, theism. And what's interesting here, and people theists don't like this argument. But
No.
like,
Yeah.
it's an interesting potential new argument for atheism. Basically, you say like either divine simplicity is true or false. That octane divine simplicity that I was articulating earlier. Then you say, well, either way, really, God couldn't, like a true God, like a God worth wanting, couldn't exist either way, because if it's true, well, then you have all these objections to divine simplicity and so on that we've been covering here, and
Yeah.
so you face like really significant difficulties. So you don't want to go down that horn. But if you say that it's false, well, then like, I don't know, you're going to be admitting like things that are intrinsic to God, distinct from God. God's, there are going to be non-God things, non-God existing positive ontological items that are ase, that are independent, that are necessarily existent, that are uncreated, and so on. Like, if you told that to theists for like the last couple thousands of years, they would have like screamed.
Right.
So like,
so some of them do that with PVI does that with the Platonic horde.
Yeah.
And he says, yeah, but so this would be different. And Tom Ward is like, yeah, that's not okay. Like, don't do that. But if this were the case, then it's still, there's nothing outside of God. It's not like the properties exist outside of him. So they're still existentially grounded in one of those ways in God himself, right?
Yeah. So there are definitely ways to go about this. One way is the hold apart grounding, right? You say that yes, okay, fine, there are necessarily existent things that God didn't create, but hey, they're grounded in God, and they're they're intrinsic to God, and God is grounding them. So like,
but a lot of theists do not like that, and
well, one potential difficulty is like, well, hey, grounding seems to be a metaphysical relation, and there's a kind of metaphysical priority and posteriority there. But in that case, well, then surely God would already have to, as it were, be there in order to be able to ground his essential parts. But if he must already be there, as it were, ontologically prior to grounding them, well, then he must already have his essential properties and so on, because he's already there, and you can't exist without your essential properties. So
unless he's this 3D printer, now we get to come back.
No. So like, anyway, a lot of theists. So again, I'm not saying that this is an insuperable argument.
No, sure.
It's one that I might want to like try to write up into an article at some point.
Yeah, that'd be good.
But it's like a new argument for atheism, essentially. Like, either God, if God exists, God would be simple or not. But either way, you have some insuperable difficulties.
Finally. But so do
Anyway,
you
we
know,
need to go back to your. Oh yeah,
yeah.
after you say this, we need to go back to the
Yeah. Do
original.
you know that that's like a meme online that's like simplicity or atheism? Do you know about this in like
Yeah,
classical
yeah,
theist
I
circles?
do. I think
You
it's
could
great.
call it that. You could name it that and it would be great. And
Well, it would be atheism or atheism because,
yeah,
but
yeah. That's good. Yeah. All right. So going back to the bootstrapping, you said like is that
no,
are you good
okay,
with
yeah. Anyway,
bootstrapping there or do you want to say more?
basically, what I was saying is that you asked me about Gould's view.
Yeah.
One difficulty, and I think this is a potential difficulty. And again,
Okay.
he's gonna say things, but
For sure.
you have to face the challenge of aseity and perfect being theism, right? You would think that if God's truly this ultimate perfect being, it would seem as though he's uniquely ase. That seems to be a great making property. That seems to be a perfection. But it would seem as though he has to deny this. He says that or at least I think he says that the Platonic properties that are God's essential properties do exist ase. Now, yeah. So anyway, that's going to be a bullet to bite, I think, for
Okay.
many theists.
Yeah.
They don't want to say that there are ase necessarily existent uncreated things that are not God.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. A second thing is that I don't know, like this is just not an elegant parsimonious view. You're like have this radical divergent break in the kinds of properties that there are. Some of them are going to be created, other ones are uncreated.
Yeah.
And like that, like I don't know, the Platonic uniformly uncreated seems to be
Right.
more elegant, more
Yeah.
parsimonious. You have a unified kind of a view of properties. I don't know. It almost
And
it
he
strikes me
says
as
the same thing. Yeah, he'll
yeah,
say this is kind of an inelegant bullet to bite, though perhaps though the properties is radical break, properties created and uncreated all still can be grounded in God. So it might not be the ugliest thing, but yes, it
yeah.
is inelegant. Yeah,
So that is another cost.
yeah,
So you've got the aseity, perfect being cost. You got that cost. Um, Again, potentially you've got the potentially bootstrapping cost, which I was saying. Like, in order for God to ground these things, there's
right,
some sense in which ontologically prior to grounding them, he would already, as it were, have to exist.
right.
And because something can't exist without its essential properties, it would seem as though he would already have to have its essential properties in order to
Yeah,
ground them. So
bootstrapping
that's
squared or something. Yeah,
yeah, basically. So that's another potential worry. Again, I'm not saying because Paul Gould might be watching this, and
he will. He loves. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and
for
yeah,
sure.
and anyway, I've like seen him comment on my Facebook and so on, and I always
Yeah,
love our
man.
interactions. So I just sending a heart out to Paul Gould,
That's
and
great.
boiler up, right? So
That's right.
anyway, much love to him. But again, I'm not saying that this isn't suitable for him. He might be able to.
Right.
Well, and he probably has responses and so on. So anyway,
Yeah.
we could go on further with that, but I think that suffices.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's finish up with the TC unduly restricts God, his freedom and his control, which we've been touching
Yeah,
on already, anyways.
yeah. So basically, I don't know. I know William Lane Craig has I think it's in his 5th chapter in his book. He raises this problem as well. I know Felipe
Mm.
Leon does it, but it's like in order to explain like the necessity and the objectivity and so on of numbers and propositions and so on, it's going to have to be the case that God must think these thoughts. He
Right.
cannot fail to think them. And in the case of maybe grounding, or in the case that he causes other properties, like it seems as though he's like forced or compelled in some way to create them. Like
Yeah.
it's necessarily the case that he does that. What, you're telling me God can't refrain from creating? Like, gosh,
Yeah.
wow. Again, you tell that to people in the theistic tradition going back. Again, some people are like, screw the tradition, but you tell that to the tradition, and they're gonna be like, whoa, no, God is definitely free to refrain from creating.
Yeah. So Joe,
But
does it enter in like a modal collapse as well? Like,
I don't think so
okay.
because I mean you'd have a modal collapse with respect to a particular domain, but like
Yeah.
that was the whole point, right? So like
Yeah.
they're going to say that yeah, God necessarily creates, let's say, properties in the case of theistic activism or
Yep.
maybe modified theistic activism. So yeah, you have in some sense a modal collapse with respect to like those properties, but like that was the
That's not
goal,
the
right?
yeah.
We want those to be
Yeah.
necessarily existent.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
you wouldn't automatically under that view have modal collapse simpliciter. Um, but yeah, and even if God doesn't like create these sorts of things, but if they're like uncaused thoughts within God's mind, or maybe they're just uncaused but grounded thoughts in God's mind, or maybe they're even just caused in God's mind, um, because propositions, many of them are necessarily true, they're gonna have to be necessarily existent. God's gonna have to think them. He must think them. He's required. He's compelled, it seems, to think them.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know. God isn't free to refrain from doing that. Then now, of
Yeah.
course, some people are just like, screw your leeway freedom. I've got sourcehood freedom. So,
Dude, I
mic
like
drop.
that. That's right. That's not so bad. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're a Calvinist, right? So
Yeah.
you already say screw leeway freedom,
That's right,
probably.
man. Take that. I like some guidance control in my life. Well, Joe, okay, what if we don't want to toss out pap or anything like that for God? What if okay, he's got to think about these thoughts, but he can control his propositional attitudes about them. They serve as the content of his thinking or his act,
Some
you know what I
kind of
mean?
propositional attitude, belief-like state, essentially.
Yeah, so he doesn't have like, yeah, what do you think? Does he still get freedom if he's got to think about them,
Well,
but
definitely not leeway freedom, right? Because God's omniscient, right? So he must believe all and only the true ones, and he must
yeah,
disbelieve all and only the false ones. So he doesn't have leeway freedom there. Oh, well, yeah, he does, because he has freedom to, well, with respect to the contingent ones, because he could
right,
create, he could freely choose to create some of them or
right,
not, and consequent upon that, he can choose what to believe and not to believe with respect to creation, because he
yeah,
can choose what's actually there.
right,
So
right.
I guess, yeah, with respect to the contingent ones, I guess he'll have leeway, freedom there. But like
And
the
he's got like
problem,
his own sense of like divine doxastic voluntarism,
yeah,
which is
exactly,
nice.
yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. Like, oh man, theism implies a kind of doxastic voluntarism, but maybe someone thinks that like doxastic voluntarism is just inherently confused. Maybe there's like something in the nature of belief that debars that. That might be an
Yeah,
interesting argument. I mean, I don't really find that
but
plausible because God's
right,
beliefs are different.
On God's part, right? Yeah, so it wouldn't matter anyways. Like
Yeah,
we're
God's
not
beliefs are
God.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But sorry, I'm playing with Legos as I do this.
no, that's all right.
Uh,
I'm playing with stuff too.
okay. Yeah. So like but yeah, I guess. But the problem was supposed to be with respect to the necessary ones. Like, yeah, okay, fine. He has the control, leeway
Yeah,
freedom with respect to the
yeah,
contingent ones. But the problem is that there are infinitely many necessary ones that he doesn't have leeway freedom with respect to. So, I don't know.
yeah.
I feel like you're just gonna have to say that God doesn't have leeway freedom with these sorts of things. And I mean, maybe that's a bull. Again, we might think that a perfect being should be able to refrain from creating anything or
Hmm.
refrain from doing any kind of activity that it might otherwise do. You know, if it can't, then that would seem to be some kind of restriction. And many
Yeah.
people in the at least in the classical theistic tradition, and just theism more generally, have said that God is free to refrain from creating. So it would kind of be revisionary in some sense, it seems.
Right, and it's like we all want to in theology, like it can't be emanation. Like this is not, Plotinus, but it seems like he's sneezing out these necessary truths.
Yeah, well,
And
that's another thing. Trying to distinguish between necessary creation and emanation, like that's gonna be difficult.
yeah, and I'm still trying to figure out what Leftow is talking about with his biggest bang and stuff like that. I'm trying to figure. Okay,
Yeah,
I don't mean that derogatory at all, Dr. Leftow. Please come on. But I'm still trying to figure out. It's tough stuff. Like, yeah, you're a
yeah,
smart dude.
yeah,
Um,
and I mean, I guess so. I really do think that the theistic conceptualists. If I have my theistic conceptualist hat on, I'm just going to bite the bullet and say, "Yep, no leeway freedom with respect to those necessary truths or necessary properties and so on." But he's got sourcehood freedom, and that's all you need. Deal
yeah,
with it, mic drop. I mean, that's what I'm going to do.
yeah,
It might be slightly revisionary with respect to the theistic tradition, but I don't know. And I mean, I do kind of share some of the intuitions that yeah, a perfect being should be free to refrain from creating. But and of course, we're getting into the debate between like compatibilist and
I know.
libertarian.
We got to
So
bring
those
Paul
with
Manata. Yeah, Paul
yeah,
Manata,
exactly.
step into the chat, and here we go.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
No, that's a good point though.
one's
It's
one's one's views here might kind of supervene on one's views there, because a lot of
yeah,
people are like really tied to Pap.
yeah,
Other people are like, screw Pap, man.
yes, that's
It's so
right.
interesting that there are these divergent things. I'm still trying to figure out what to make of the free will debate.
Well, I saw you just get that book for Christmas, so
I got both those books.
let's go.
Those were unironically to try. It's not like I haven't studied this. Like I've taken
No, I know, I know.
courses with like Michael Bergman. No, I
Yeah,
know I'm not trying to say with you, but like I've taken classes like Michael Bergman on like freedom, compatibilism, fatalism, foreknowledge, and so on. And it's like there are just so many different views, and like the arguments. Like I'm pulled by the manipulation argument, but I'm also
I know.
pulled by the luck objection. It's like I don't know what to believe, man.
I know. Like imagine that's your job. You're a philosopher of free will, and you get to you have to write an opinion on this. Like I don't know what the
Yeah.
heck. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, I think it might supervene on one's views there. I mean, what the libertarians might say, like, oh no, you actually don't get sourcehood here, because what's the ultimate source of these sorts of things? It seems to be God's nature, and God doesn't have control over God's nature. In order to
Right.
exert control over anything, you would already have to exist, and hence already have your nature. So
Yeah.
actually, God isn't the appropriate source of these. It's something. It's like God's nature or something like that. It's something in God that, I don't know, is distinct from God qua agent.
Yeah.
So you might try to run that kind of objection to the sourcehood reply, that actually there is some kind of there's some kind of inappropriate source here, that's there's some kind of more fundamental explanation than God qua agent. So
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to think through with the truth maker type stuff. So yeah, no, I feel you. Again, dude, tricky stuff, and nominalism sounds inviting when I have to think through this out loud with you.
know.
But dude, thanks so much for. I'm saying dude a lot now because we're both laughing about how much I say colloquial phrases, and it irks some of the
I say
philosophers
do it
listening.
more, trigger them.
Yeah, that's
Trigger
right.
them.
Pensées, and we'll go even harder on it.
Yeah, dude, we're doing triggering, we're doing
That's right.
dude, we got
That's
the
right.
memes, we got the
Yeah. Okay, so Joe, you've done a whole 2 hours on this exact topic, the Augustinian proof. So I'm gonna link that in the description. You got a book that hopefully gets like finished soon, like accepted
Yeah, it's
fully,
under
and I
review,
can
yeah.
tell them to hurry up. So I'm looking forward to that. But where else, man? Where else can people find you? You got a website now, so that's something.
Yeah, oh my goodness, I got a website. It's Joseph, yes, not Joe, josephschmid.com. That's Joseph, and then Schmid, as you can see, like right there.
There it is.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so people can find like my papers and so on there, and yeah, basically that's like my central hub now, josephschmid.com. But like, YouTube, Majesty of Reason, my blog. I mean, my blog is now going to be shifted to the josephschmid.com, but for the next couple of months, I'm going to be posting on both, just
Awesome.
for people. So yeah, I guess those places, and at Purdue, of course. So
That's right.
you'll
Well,
find
dude,
me at Purdue.
thanks so much for helping me think through this stuff, man. It's still like a live thing for me, and I send. For those who don't know, I send Joe Facebook messages all the time, and he always responds super quick with these messages. And so it's really helping me think through this stuff. So, dude, I appreciate all your work and going at phasers so hard. I like that too.
Yeah, I appreciate your channel as well. We both watch each other's. I said this before, but we both
That's
watch
right.
each other's channels and really enjoy them. So
Yeah.
everyone subscribe to both of them, of course, and our
Yes, do
perfectly
it.
unbiased opinions. But yeah, thank you for having me on here. I really enjoyed this. I think this is such a fun topic. It brings in so many different areas like
Yes.
epistemology, metaphysics, grounding, theory choice, theory comparison.
Right.
Yeah, even math. We got into math.
Yeah, we did. Way beyond my capacity, but yeah. All right, so folks, that's gonna have to do it for now. But Joe will be back. Dude's awesome, and go check out his channel, all that stuff. Like Joe said, that's gonna have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.